everyone. Thanks for sticking around. I know this day has gone on longer than expected, so we're really excited that you've stuck around for our panel. We're going to be talking a little bit about the future of VR in education. I'm joined by an incredible panel coming from a lot of different sides of the discussion, everything from hardware to software to content to the funding of these projects. So first we'll start off with some introductions. I'm Kate Machtiger. I'm a strategist at Luminary Labs. We're a strategy and innovation consultancy here in New York, and we've been working with the US Department of Education on helping them realize their vision for VR and AR simulations as a tool for training students for jobs of the future. And Albert will talk a little bit more about that. It's called the Edson Challenge. But my background is also in architecture and engineering, so I have a personal interest in VR as well. So Gemma?
Hi everyone, I'm Gemma. I'm the CEO of Discovr Labs. We're a VR education startup that focuses on K-12 vocational and professional content.
My name is DiCarlo at Samsung Electronics America, and we make the Gear VR and Gear 360, and sort of our vision for VR is that it will scale to the size of anybody with a smartphone today, so very much focused on mainstream use cases for VR beyond gaming, and that includes, of course, education.
Hi everyone, I'm Jessica Lindell. I'm the global head of education for Unity Technologies. Hopefully you are all working with us to create your experiences. Our goal at Unity is to enable everyone to become a creator, and as we embark on XR overall, we're really excited to collaborate and partner in completely new ways with you.
I'm Albert Palacios. I'm with the U.S. Department of Education, Office of Career, Technical, and Adult Education. And we are, I've been working on the Edson Challenge, and hopefully you've heard of that. The Edson Challenge since about 2012, and we are now approaching, we've announced finalists, and we're now approaching the demo day in September 18th. So we're looking for AR and VR and simulated environments for delivering educational content, specifically around technical skills.
Great. So I'd love to kick it off hearing about each of your first experiences with VR, and how has it changed since then?
I think my first experience was a really janky demo at a hackathon of a blob that you could push around. And it was kind of cool, but very disorienting. Not necessarily something I wanted to try again, but something that I could see had potential to be very cool.
I got to watch a 360 video of Snoop Dogg in like a kind of a studio environment freestyling. And it was my first 360 video, and even though it was a little bit low resolution, I felt like I was there with Snoop in this crowd and head bobbing. and that was what I toured around when I was introducing, Hollywood partners or ad partners to VR, and they were all similarly blown away by it. And I've never seen a demo that was that durable that you could show for that long in a row, and so that was when I was hooked.
Mine was probably like most of you, reading about Ready Player One years ago, and just thinking about the incredible potential that we were embarking upon.
So I'm thinking a little older than that, and this is I think the origins of kind of what this VR experience is are the GAF Viewmasters. You remember those little things that used to have photographic images that on the disc? Wow, nobody remembers those. You could go to the Grand Canyon. You could go to Grand Canyon. You'd get one from Six Flags. You could get them from wherever you visited. But kind of thinking in the terms of what we're talking about here, I just remember Wolfenstein 3D back in the mid-'90s or late '90s, and thinking kind of how immersive it was and how rudimentary the graphics were, and they were still engaging enough to get you hooked. And I just appreciated the kind of the evolution of the technology and watched that technology along the way as it continued to develop. So that's kind of what hooked me initially, and it's kind of kept me going ever since.
Great. Well, we've obviously come a long way since our first experiences with VR, and now kind of want to take you thinking about the future. In 5 or 10 years, how do you see VR manifesting in the classroom or in the educational setting? And I know, Albert, you're coming from the US Department of Education. Gemma, you're coming from a content perspective and you're working in schools, and then you're both coming from kind of hardware and software side. So just curious to see how all these visions might differ.
Well, when I think of VR in the classroom in the future, it's definitely very prominent. Undeniably, so many students are visual learners, and so much content can be taught visibly most effectively. So I can think of like history, certain life sciences, even things like statistics. We've been testing schools, and like they clearly tell us that their retention rates are going up. So as the price point decreases, I can easily see this becoming something almost like a laptop cart, that while not every classroom may have it day to day, it's something that schools know is better for their students and something that they'll have for their students to use.
And I think from education content standpoint, I think we're on the precipice of having to rethink what it means to deliver educational content and how we do it and what the classroom looks like. So 5 to 10 years down the road, I would hope to see more AR, VR experiences in the classroom, but also just rethinking what it means to be a student and having more student-centric approaches to defining the content. And then also for it to be the teachers, having the teachers understand that they're not, this doesn't eliminate the role of the teacher, but it might change it a little, and also strengthen and empower the teacher to create a different relationship with students and with the school.
I think my hope is that we evolve from, kind of the student as the recipient to the student as the creator, as we think about mixed reality and augmented reality and, the writing projects of today, perhaps becoming the XR projects of tomorrow, where learners are creating feedback for their educators and instructors to evaluate what they've learned and how comprehensive their understanding is. And I think that, the learner as the creator is really the direction that we want to head in, and that this gives us a platform to move into.
And I think about, if you think about VR in that 5 to 10 year horizon, one of the sort of hopes and promises of it is this idea of we can be together even if we're not physically in the same environment. And if you think about that from an educational context and potentially equity, access to maybe equipment that's expensive, or even access to the best teachers if they're not available in your zip code, that you could have equitable distribution of really high quality education by leveraging VR technology, which maybe seems expensive, but if it can solve that problem, is potentially very inexpensive.
So talking a little bit about sort of the expense of getting VR into schools you talked about, would it be like a laptop cart? You're saying it could solve a lot of expense problems. What do you all think is the biggest barrier to getting VR into classrooms today? And I can start with Nick. If you're coming from kind of the hardware perspective, is that holding things back?
I think that the relative expense of it seems expensive if you don't know what to do with it. Or if the software experiences and the content and the sort of the ecosystem hasn't built up around it, then it's extremely expensive. It's just a luxury, right? But if you can find that, utility and it's replacing costs of building maintenance or textbooks or something that's more disposable, or access to equipment that would be hundreds of thousands of dollars or potentially dangerous to the students, all of those savings easily pay for the kind of equipment that we're talking about here. There's a great example from the challenge. I don't know if I don't want to steal your
go
example,
ahead.
but I heard
want to
about
talk to it more.
where they're doing a Case Western, they're doing cadaver dissection. And cadavers cost $6,000 a piece, and they're single use. So even a $3,000 HoloLens for every student is dramatically less expensive than a $6,000 cadaver per student. And so that's a case of you're trading the old way to the new way, and it's much more efficient to use what is very expensive hardware in that moment. So, I think those opportunities are going to be really plentiful as the culture of content delivery changes.
And you mentioned the Edson challenge. I'd love, Albert, for you to talk a little bit more about how this is going to help students train for careers as well, so you maybe are saving some of those expenses.
Sure. So at the core of the Edson challenge is to hopefully inspire the industry, the development industry, both entertainment software, game development, education markets, to hopefully define a more common protocol for design development so that they can, regardless of the platform or the engines or the stack you're using, they can better connect and exchange data with each other, and they can become more of an ecosystem of interoperable experiences, but beyond that, be interdependent. And that's something that we really want to see. We're really pushing to move towards interdependent simulations so that it's not just about interoperating with each other, but actually impacting each other's experiences. Because then that leads to greater gains in things like what we call employability skills, those skills that that have been found to lead to better success in the workplace and in education, things like communication, problem-solving, systems thinking, all of those. So if we can create that common protocol or have it emerge in industry, then that will create a more predictable market for design and procurement from the systems, school systems standpoint. So then everybody kind of sees what the environment looks like, or should look like, or needs to look like, and they can develop more in that direction so that they can be assured that their product is more accepted in the marketplace and adoptable because of hopefully streamlined procurement processes, streamlined development processes, shared libraries of assets. Just kind of there's kind of a domino effect from that common protocol. So we're pursuing that common protocol just as its basic elements to see what that might look like. And just as a sidebar, I mean, trying to get to that common design standard, I went to and visited one of the VR demonstrations, and I hadn't even brought up anything about the Edson challenge, but what the presenter told me was that, and they'll remain nameless, is that the platforms that they were using were rendered in 2 different engines, and the first 2 chapters didn't work with the 3rd chapter because they were developing different engines, and they needed an audio bridge to transition from the 1st and 2nd to the 3rd. So, you know, it's just seeking some sort of common language, common bridge that can enable all of the platforms, proprietary or open source, to begin to start working with each other. Through that, we see a more stabilized marketplace for development and selling to educational markets. And that's, without that, then your investment in development is too burdensome to really pursue the education market. And that's what we're trying to do, is reduce that cost for development, reduce the cost of teachers and students and end users.
Sure. And Jessica, you know, Unity plays a big role in this kind of common framework. A lot of developers are developing on Unity. Also, Unity is giving out free licenses to schools. What's your vision for the role you'll play going forward as more devices are developed and more schools start using these kinds of tools?
Yeah, I think that the recommendation I was going to give to that panelist was just use Unity. You can develop to every platform. Going back to your prior question leads me to the answer, which I think the biggest challenge we have is really supporting the educator in the classroom. That, you know, of course there's a barrier for the cost of hardware, but there's also a challenge on how do we ensure that we're not making their job more difficult with the addition of this technology, that we're actually making their job easier, supporting the change in the teacher practice that they need to go through. And so one of the key leverage points that we're focusing on at Unity is how do we really create the right tools for the educator to feel empowered and kind of leading this change within their classroom. Given that from at least my conversations with the U.S. Department of Education, as we look at the post-secondary instructor education programs, you know, in the U.S. and around the world, they really, you know, haven't necessarily changed quickly enough to keep up with the technology that is coming into the classroom. So it's not like we're having, you know, the talent coming into the pipeline ready to be able to embrace these technologies. So how do we collaborate with these educators? And then how do we not force something on them, but how do we actually co-design the right tools, the right lesson plans and courseware and curriculum with them so that they ensure that they can feel most effective in their roles?
Great. And Gemma, you're working with schools to work on creating content. What do you see as some of their biggest challenges or what's missing right now?
The biggest challenges for the school in implementing?
Yeah.
Generally, they don't actually know how to implement the VR quite a lot. So what we've learned is that we have to make it as simple as possible. So when they're buying the hardware, they don't buy the hardware. We put packages together. So in that package, it includes the PC, the HMD, everything that they could possibly need so that they don't have to look into the nitty-gritty details and it's just ready to go. And so we also have an onboarding package where somebody flies out, we help them set everything up. And that's really important for them. What we learned in the past is we would go from this 2 to 3 week thing where like they were trying to figure out how to get it started, how to get the content going, how to get the software going, and they can get very discouraged with the technology in that time. So helping educators, realizing that, they may not be super technical and that this is something you have to help out with makes a ginormous difference. It's also convincing school boards. So we learned really early on that like school boards do have money laying around a lot of times, specifically designated for technology. So you have to learn how to read through that documentation and kind of figure out what you can help them with. So a lot of schools have really old PCs and they need to update them. So you can be like, well, why don't we help you find a PC that's also VR compatible, and at the same time you invest in a couple of HMDs, and that goes a really long way, especially with the price of like VR-ready PCs having been cut in half in a year.
So Nick, you're agreeing. Do you think that the biggest change that schools are going to have to make is sort of this equipment side, or?
Yeah, I think it's just the general purchasing process, and I think Gemma's, indicating how sophisticated her and her company are to be able to communicate sort of in the language of schools and purchasing entities within that environment. And there's such a different universe of selling tech, normally what we do, and selling to an education entity, and bridging that divide is really important. And obviously their success is a testament to how they've engineered that process for the customer rather than trying to apply a tech process to it.
I'd love to hear a little bit more on the content side. I know you guys are doing work across a wide range of subjects from history to medicine. Do you feel like VR is good at teaching certain subjects over others, or are you just working based on the demand of the schools?
I think before I used to think that it was better at teaching certain subjects, and I realized that that was kind of a biased opinion on my own, because I personally don't like seeing math in VR. I never thought it was helpful for me. I always thought that my thought process was if I could watch a YouTube video and learn it, then it probably shouldn't be in VR, but that's not true, I've learned. We ran a couple of statistics experiences, and while I personally would not want to learn math that way, to a lot of students it was incredibly helpful. We even put together a geometry experience where you can just kind of see the triangles in front of you and move them around and such, and it was incredibly helpful to them. I do think that for like life sciences and history, it is clearly so obvious that it is just a great tool. So our first experience was a Rome experience that we spent a ridiculous amount of time doing, and it was very high fidelity, and the students adored it. Like they could run around. It felt like a game, but it was a lead game. And they had to hit certain milestones in order to be able to reach the next level, and their retention rates went up by 80% on their history tests, which later led on to like an AP history exam going up significantly for that school. So I do think that there are certain subjects where it would affect more students more broadly. So history, life science, anything incredibly visual. But I do think that there is an avenue for every subject for VR. I think it'll work better for some, but I do think that VR is definitely an answer for all subjects if done correctly.
Great. And Albert, do you want to talk a little bit about VR for careers in terms of content? What's your dream content in terms of career training?
So this is another fundamental concept that we're trying to bring forth in Edson. So I discussed that, or I mentioned the interoperability and interdependence, but we see that as a benefit to the career training and preparation. So as we are educating the students for both the academic and the technical skills, we also feel that interdependence is critical, because then that's where you begin to not just understand, for example, something in the health science field where you might be working with a patient through simulation, learning phlebotomy, but now the impact of that is impacting the surgeon that may or may not be in your high school, but they may be in a post-secondary institution working on a simulation. Or maybe there is another high school classmate working on the orthoscopic surgery, even though they're not a qualified, we're not going to teach you're not going to get the medical education in high school, but at least you're exposed to that as a career pathway. You understand what's involved. You understand, all the blood and guts that are involved. Well, maybe that's not a career path for me. Maybe I want something more mechanically oriented. Maybe I want to work in robotics. So you can begin to transfer those skills that you do want and you do like and pursue career pathways that might not otherwise be accessible. Going back to what Nick was talking about, of making those, a student may not have gotten into welding because they don't have a welding teacher within 30 miles or a welding program, but what if they could do it virtually? Same thing with health science or any other career pathway. So we need to kind of rethink what the benefits and leverage those benefits of VR and the internet to to increase access to these educational programs. But then with that, of course, comes the bandwidth issues and the device issues and the hardware and software issues. But that's why we're hoping to, again, go towards those common design protocols so that a more universal design can be layered on top of that to make more career pathways available to more students and allow them to pursue whatever career pathways they choose. But we see that interdependence and reliance on other related career pathways to be critical to that knowledge, the acquisition of knowledge, and the accelerating that learning experience for the student.
You talked a bit about the social side of it, and right now a lot of people will try a VR experience and might find it sort of isolating in that they're putting on a headset, and there isn't a lot of multiplayer capability out there. Mm-hmm. How far away do you guys think that social side is, and how important is it to the education market?
I don't think it's far away at all. I mean, we've implemented multiplayer stuff before. Other schools have as well, and other companies. I think where I've seen it happen most often was with vocational schools for nursing students who were practicing on a body or just sort of working on like architectural projects. I don't think it's necessarily far away. I do think it's important in certain experiences, ones where you want to get used to working on a team, like the vocational ones. I don't think it's important for every single one. I think VR can be effective as a singular experience, but of course, the collaborative part of it definitely helps. We've found within high school students that when they work on their science projects together, within just sort of like a sandbox module, their retention rates go up, and we think it's mainly just due to the same reason when you work with your friends in person, you want to do better because your friends are pushing you to do better. So I think it's helpful if you think about it in the same way that schools want you to work collaboratively. But I do think VR is very powerful on its own. It can just be more powerful with the help of others.
I think the education context is a perfect environment, actually, for multiplayer VR. So if you're thinking about it as like a consumer just buys a VR device at Best Buy, and you want to try multiplayer, you have to hope maybe you know somebody or that somebody's online in the game you feel like playing to do multiplayer. But in an educational context, the teacher can say, we're all going to get in this together, and now we're in a multiplayer environment, and you know that your classmates are going to be there. So the tech is there. It's just more of like creating those moments, creating those venues where they can get that experience where it's appropriate from a curriculum perspective.
So I think we want to take it one step further from that, because we understand multiplayer environments exist and have existed for a while. But if you think, and I just kind of want to lay out this scenario to kind of help everyone visualize. So if you imagine the flight simulator, it's been around forever, it's first person, you can do some great flight training in that. But that pilot who's flying that flight simulator, when they land in the real world, there's a whole crew of workers that kind of, swarm around the airplane. You have the sanitation, you have fuel, you have catering, you have mechanics, you have electrical, you have the ground crew, the cabin crew. You have all of these different occupations that intersect with that pilot. Well, why can't those also be simulations? And so some of those do exist now. I saw a lab in a school in DC that has 5 flights, actually a big classroom full of flight simulators, and they actually have an air traffic controller station within that. So that's done. But then when you extend it out further, thinking beyond the bounds of that, then those could be different simulations in different environments. So perhaps somebody is in civil engineering or in planning and zoning, they might need to get some data out of that simulated experience that could better drive an airport, airport design. And then you go further beyond that, and you have people like electricians and customer service workers, and you have a whole array of occupations that intersect not just with the pilot, but with all the others that are satellite that are extended from that. So you create this kind of almost like a neural network of various occupations are all intersecting. And so if we can get all of those simulations that may not be developed by the same designer company or on the same platform to begin to interact, then hopefully we can create a more accessible ecosystem of simulations that are available, on the headsets, on the telephones, on their Xbox and PSP and other game consoles in their homes, on their smart TVs, on any device that they might have. They can continue that experience, and once they get engaged, they're going to go home to their console on their own, and they're going to be comfortable in that environment. So that's we want to see that kind of have that domino effect, and so we're trying to tip the first domino.
I want to take two things from that. One is sort of to create all these simulations, you're going to need a pipeline of developers, right? And that's something, Jessica, I'm sure you're thinking about, and Nick as well. Sort of, how are VR developers being taught and made today, and what's the future for employment in that industry? Can you talk a little bit about what Unity is thinking about how the developers of the future in VR are getting started today?
Sure. Yeah, I do want to add on to the last question as well, which is let's not lose sight of the power of co-play too. I think some of the most engaging VR experiences I've seen have been one person using a headset in a whole classroom instructional experience with the entire classroom, kind of watching what's happening on the screen and learning from that too. So I don't know if ultimately multiplayer is the end-all be-all for that type of collaboration.
Nor is VR. I mean, I don't believe
yeah.
VR is the end-all for everything either, but I think going back to one of Gemma's comments, it's making sure that it's appropriate for the instructional model.
Yeah, absolutely. So as far as how are we preparing the developers of tomorrow, this may seem totally obvious, but what we're really trying to focus on is how do we actually teach VR in VR as the context. So prototyping some experiences right now around how you can actually learn the practice in a virtual reality setting without a significant amount of programming skills or very strong computational understanding, which again really broadens the base of creators and instructors we can work with.
Just in the last 3 years, it went from people would say to me, Unity developers, oh, they're easy to find, to now nobody can find one. There's in such demand though, right? It feels like there's been a huge kind of spike in the demand for that skill set.
Yeah, and I think there's just so many forecasts around the incredible growth of VR that we're seeing that I won't recite them here because I just find them so astronomical and crazy. It's unnecessary. But yes, trying to keep up with that demand and tapping into a broader base, again, that doesn't have that strict computer science.
Unity
background.
VR developers are even so much harder to find.
Yeah.
Well, Gemma, you started developing before you started your company, right?
Right, yeah.
And what was your path to finding, VR as a career path?
I went to a hackathon, and I didn't really know how to do anything. I think my background before that was just first robotics. And it was very intimidating because people there clearly knew how to code. I got really lucky. A really nice guy went up, pitched his idea, sounded really hard, sounded like a really, really hard game. And then he said, oh yeah, by the way, if you don't know how to program and you want to, just come to my table. So I sat with him for 24 hours. He taught me how to make a Unity game. And after that, I was like really hooked. I started going to hackathons every weekend. I'm not kidding. And then I started working for a company that like creates hackathons and basically only does hackathons. And I did hackathons for a living. But I loved games, and Unity was the easiest way for me to make games. So I learned Unity very well. I realized that like programming is this thing where people like different things. Like most of the times when I tried to do an intro to programming, it was always like apps and iOS apps. That wasn't really my go-to thing. I really liked making PC games, so Unity was a really good fit for me. Eventually I went to a hackathon and someone was like, you've made a lot of games on Unity, you should try making a VR game. And they shoved an Oculus Rift in my hands and I was like, okay. And then I made one, and it was a lot of fun. So I just kept doing that. But I'd always worked in education. So for me, like, the intersection that I always wanted to work on was education, accessibility, and then my newfound passion, which was VR. So
By the way, Gemma is like, what, 19 now? I mean, this all happened.
I'm turning 19 tomorrow.
Happy birthday! I mean, you're so exceptional because this all, like, everything you're describing happened when you were like 14, 15, and I think it's incredible just what you've been able to create so far. So we're excited to watch what you do next.
So
Or when
you
some
know,
of us were 40 or,
you mentioned a lot of different things you're interacting with there, Unity, Oculus, and Nick, you're here from Samsung. I'd love to hear more about like how the partnerships in VR are maybe a little different than you might see in the gaming industry, or maybe how partnerships will play a role in expanding VR.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think VR has a gaming heritage. It was sort of born from that world. I mean, besides the stuff in the 60s and 70s, but the sort of modern era of VR definitely has that gaming heritage. And when we first thought about it, Samsung doesn't have any gaming heritage as a company itself. And so we were basically interested in anything but gaming. The 360 video, the social experiences, and then education and other sort of enterprise applications, but recognized that the tools from gaming were that sort of that language that would be the driver of it. And so what we've tried to do throughout our efforts to help the community is to create those connections between this tech and the skilled developers, maybe that have some gaming background, and then the business use case for these non-gaming applications, so that everyone can sort of see those other skills. And that's been the cool thing about VR, and Oculus set the tone really early, that it was sort of this open environment. Everyone's learning. We have a almost 19-year-old CEO or COO. And so that's an amazing place to be, and it's like a very welcoming environment. And I think everyone just learns from each other, and so it's not, journalists always come at us like, what about the competition? And we always say there's no competition, it's just we're all just trying to make this happen together, and that's been, I think, almost universally true.
and I think that's an important concept to carry forward, because we see that this, if we are to pursue a common protocol in a true ecosystem of educational simulations, that all of the proprietary components need to begin to be more interoperable and working with each other. And I think I just keep thinking of the song, Give a Little Bit. If everyone gives a little bit, I think everybody's going to gain significantly from it. So that's, I hope that everyone can kind of open up their systems, their technologies, obviously at risk of some, commercial viability and profitability, but in the long run, I think that that's what we're really going to need to really spur a robust marketplace and sustainable marketplace.
So I'd like to switch gears a little bit and we've been talking about all the great things about VR in education. What are some of the misconceptions that you're dealing with in your day-to-day that maybe should be reconsidered?
I think a lot of the schools that we work with expect their retention rates to go through the roof at the first experience. And so we talk to a lot of schools, a lot of which don't use our content, and a lot of them are consistently disappointed with VR education content because most of the pieces that they get are one-off pieces of content. So their students watch one experience, they get tested afterwards, their retention rates didn't go up, which isn't surprising because they only watched one experience. The teachers have no motivation to show them that experience again, nor do the students want to, because they've already been through it. So I think the biggest misconception from teachers is just thinking that just watching the VR once is going to get you to a miraculous new place, which is why I think the education VR scene has a lot to grow, because we need content studios that are making consistent pieces of content for these students to watch, like curriculum, to consistently be viewing something. So we've been trying something that's sort of like Brain Poppy, which is where we make a video based on a piece of content or a piece of educational content, and they watch one a week. So it's continuous and it lasts the whole year. And so you can look at the curriculum that most schools are using. You can see Common Core content. You can see at what point of the year they're most likely going to be studying what. So you can make packages for grades. And so then the teachers have the access to be able to watch these things and watch them with their students. so that they're not feeling abandoned. Because I know a lot of schools put in quite a lot of money for one piece of VR for it to do absolutely nothing for them. Like it's flashy, the students like it for the first time, but after that, what then? Do they spend another 10 to 25K creating a new experience, or do they like try to find someone to license it from? So I think the biggest misconception is just the teachers not knowing what to expect. And maybe it's sometimes how we're pitching it. We're telling them it's going to revolutionize education, but we also need to pitch it correctly and be like, yes, it's something that is going to revolutionize education if you're doing it right. It's like any other piece of content. You have to continually watch it and work with it in order to see a result. You can't just watch it once. And I think that's really difficult for teachers to understand right now, mainly because of the price point and the way that most content studios are set up, in that they sell you something once, and that's already so high budget that a school couldn't fathom doing it again.
Do you guys agree?
One of the things is people come to us and say, we want to do VR in the classroom, and sort of like, we want to do internet in the classroom. Like, what does that mean? Like, do you want to make websites? Do you want to, receive content over the internet? And VR is sort of, I try to describe it as a medium in the same way that the internet is. Like, they could learn to code. You could consume content. You could interact with, equipment that's too expensive for you. So we try to like explain sort of the various points of entry. I think the other, is a kind of the classic tech thing of, we just want to do the same thing we're already doing, but in VR, and then that's going to be suddenly awesome. And it never is. Like, it has to design something for VR to work. And so I spend actually most of my time trying to convince people not to try something in VR, just because I don't want them to try the wrong thing, basically. And I want them to like think about it a little bit more and come to a really high impact use.
Agree.
Yeah, I agree that, two things. One is, I don't use the word game in the EdSim challenge because game often faces resistance entering the classroom. So there may be elements of game theory within the simulations, but the focus is the actual technology and rendering and conceptualization in simulated environments. So I'm emphasizing that and less so on the game theory. Game theory is great, it's effective if done right, and so there's nothing wrong with it. It's just that I think it's just a focus and a perception from a teacher's standpoint of what they're bringing into their classroom. That being said, the way that simulations or should be developed or are developed, effective ones, are almost the same as the way a textbook is developed. There's still the research, the accreditation, the validation. A lot of that content still needs to go into these experiences. They still have to have that same design approach. It just has that added element of the technology in it. But the content, this is a content delivery mechanism, and it's a channel and a medium, and we need to not expect it to do something that you can have bad textbooks just as you can have bad VR. So.
Jessica?
Yeah, I think the only thing to add is a misperception that it has to be a really involved experience, that it can actually be a really light, again, augmented reality experience. So just a quick anecdote, I've got my 8-year-old with me on this trip, and it's his first time in New York, and all he cared about was going up the tallest buildings possible. So we've been on a 48-hour tour of Top of the Rock, Empire State Building, and the Freedom Tower. And for those of you who haven't been to the Freedom Tower, it's an incredible technology experience. But what happened for us in the first two was every building we went up, we would look at the skyline, and he'd ask me a million questions about the buildings, and I had no idea what I was looking at. And then we finally get to the Freedom Tower, and they give you an iPad, and you can use the iPad to see the skyline, and then click on the various buildings and dive into stories about the buildings, which was so engaging. And just from an education and learning perspective, so much more powerful. But again, a really light experience that you wouldn't think would create that type of impact. So I feel like all of us just think about starting small and impactful. Although huge kudos to the multi-year effort you're doing, but I think there's all ranges of creation that we can have.
Yeah, I think another thing is also content curation. The biggest question I get from schools who maybe aren't trying to necessarily buy from us, but just want more knowledge on education VR in general, is that they just don't know where to start. They know that Expeditions exists, but they might not think Expeditions is right for them, or maybe they're teaching high schoolers who think Expeditions is way too kiddie. They really do not know where to start. So we've been working with the CTO of Marin County Schools, which it's a school county that basically, they're so technologically advanced, it's ridiculous. They almost function as a company. And so we've been trying to help them curate content with our own and other people's as well, and form that as a nonprofit that just helps schools in general, because it's kind of astounding that so many schools reach out and like, when they ask us, we're not going to lie to them and be like, yeah, Discovr is the answer for all of your education needs. There is definitely some companies that might be doing it better for whatever need they have, or there isn't. Or it's really hard to find the content and you have to like search the Steam store and you're not really sure if it's right. It's really hard to know what content is out there consistently, and that makes it an incredibly like high barrier to entry to teachers, because they look up education VR and they find a couple of companies, and you click on those companies and you find the one demo that they have on the Steam store. And so it's really hard for them to actually figure out what a solid plan is, versus like you can look at textbook plans, which is kind of how I would want to see VR content sort of formed out. And you can see, you know, what they retain, what quizzes they have online, what they can offer to you. But the VR, it doesn't. Like if you go to some VR website, it's like, yeah, we have really awesome like 3D animations, and we offer this and this, but we're not going to tell you what our curriculum is until you buy it, or we're not going to tell you how we're going to support you, or it just doesn't exist.
And
so,
the teachers are also interested in what standards it will meet for them.
Right.
And that's what we hear a lot is, this is great, but what standards is this going and performance measures is this going to help me meet? And so as developers, that's something that, you know, I imagine you should get you know, your educators involved as well as your content developers, and kind of focus on that, because that's what's important to the teachers from what we hear.
yeah, so curating the content is just so difficult for them. Like, it's difficult for us to know what else is out there, and that's that we're in the industry. There is no comprehensive just place where you can find everything right now. And that, you know, if it's hard for us, it is definitely very, very hard for the teachers.
So going off of what Albert just mentioned, the last question before we open it up to the audience, what advice would each of you have for people developing for VR in education?
I would say talk to a lot of teachers. I know that we sort of went through a identity crisis as a company, where we tried to figure out whether we were a VR company first or an education company first. We were demoing at a lot of VR conferences, and the feedback we got was like, cool, you're doing education, and that was great. But when we went to education conferences and there were teachers there, and they would tell us, you know, my kids are not going to like that, I don't like that, or my kids are really going to like that. Like, it goes an incredibly long way. We had teachers who were in their 60s who just are not technologically advanced at all, but can tell us how their students learn. And so we put together a board of teachers, which was 100 teachers that we would send demos to, and we would send hardware out to, and they would test it, and they would basically roast us. They would tell us if it sucked or not. And that was incredibly helpful. We know VR, and we might have some knowledge of how people learn and how we learned, but the people who are really going to have the knowledge about that is the teachers. And so they're probably the best people to have around you and to really be talking to extensively.
Yeah, I would just build on Gemma's point and just say also focus, pick a sort of segment or specific problem to solve, because it's such a huge topic.
I would say lead with emotion. I feel like a lot of what I've learned from a design perspective is that learning is so much about the emotion. And so really focus on the emotion of the learner and what you're trying to cultivate and draw out.
And I would say to think about what your experience is doing in a larger environment of what that student is learning, and obviously contextualize it, which VR does a great job at doing that, but ensure that you're connecting to the larger world of what that student should be learning.
Great. We have time for one really quick question. There is one.
Hi, I'm Mackenzie from ISTE, but I was just wondering, is anyone working on like traditional content-based VR things? Because I'm thinking of like emotional intelligence, things that are harder to teach in the classroom, and it seems like VR, since it's so immersive and emotional, could be an interesting way to teach those things that we're currently not teaching possibly very well.
I feel like empathy is the most common,
Yeah.
actually, application for VR right now.
Yeah, we had Advanced Learning reached out to us, and they wanted an empathy experience, and we were kind of on the fence on it at first because we did a lot of life sciences and a lot of history. Empathy was incredible, though, and it really, really was helpful with students that were like kindergarten through early middle school aged. So what we did was there are situations where students probably should have been empathetic to one another, and so they play those experiences out where they're talking to a human, and then they played out a similar situation, except it was a dog. So they saw a lonely-looking puppy on the street. What do? And they reacted a lot better to the dog. And so, unsurprisingly, but when faced with this sort of truth, and it's a very passive sort of truth, the students were able to really reflect. And I don't know how many times I actually reflected on how I treated others very early on. And the teachers said that it was very meaningful for them to see the students kind of reflect on how they might be treating, a puppy better than their classmates. I'm really glad that Advanced Learning really pushed us towards that, because when they had a content writer who was sort of working with us, we were sort of reluctant to have someone else write content with us, and they were like, yeah, we should do a puppy. And we were like, okay. But it ended up being a really, really good idea.
And I think the only thing I'll add is that, and we hear this a lot about specific content areas for, is there a VR experience that does this or AR or something? Going back to how the teachers are measured, it's great. Yeah, I agree that empathy is something that a student should learn, but it would be hard to get in the classroom if a teacher doesn't see that they can teach another content area where they are being measured, but with kind of that empathic foundation to that content, or having elements of that empathy embedded into it. So I would caution against having that focused of an action, because then it might be harder to get into the classroom.
I was actually thinking of like beyond empathy, like maybe if you had someone who had anger issues, and instead of sending them to like the timeout corner, since VR is like an isolated thing, like maybe it's like this abstract environment that like helps them zen out or something and then come back to the classroom, or it kind of, yeah. But interesting.
I think we're totally out of time, but thank you, everyone, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you.